there is something most people are not ready to accept, even if it is placed directly in front of them. Life today feels ordinary on the surface. People wake up, check their phones, follow the news, go to work, and assume that what they are seeing is simply the normal rhythm of the world, continuing as it always has. But beneath that appearance, there is a deeper reality unfolding, one that many refuse to confront. What is approaching, or as some would say, what is already beginning to take shape, does not resemble ordinary history. It is something that will challenge entire civilizations at their core and force individuals into decisions they cannot easily avoid or ignore. For decades, I have studied the spiritual dimensions of human existence, especially the traditions surrounding spiritual conflict, moral decline, and the teachings preserved within the Church. Over time, I have also encountered people who were not just struggling psychologically or emotionally, but who appeared deeply afflicted in ways that traditional explanations could not fully account for. These experiences have shaped my understanding of what spiritual struggle actually looks like in real life, beyond theory or abstract discussion. And through all of this, there is a growing sense that something significant is unfolding in the present moment, something that feels less like a gradual change and more like an acceleration. One of the most noticeable shifts is the way moral and spiritual confusion has intensified. What once seemed rare or isolated now appears more widespread, almost systemic. Many people feel disoriented, unsure of what is true, what is right, or even what direction society is moving in. At the same time, there is a growing silence in places that traditionally offered clarity and guidance. Where there was once strong moral teaching, there is now often hesitation, ambiguity, or avoidance. Absence of clear guidance leaves many people without a stable foundation, especially in times of uncertainty. This situation is not simply political or cultural. From a theological perspective, it reflects a deeper spiritual struggle that has always been present in human history, but now appears more visible and more intense. Throughout the teachings of Scripture and tradition, there has been a consistent warning that humanity is engaged in a form of spiritual conflict that is not always visible to the eye. This conflict is not about physical force, but about influence over belief, morality, and truth itself. When truth becomes unclear or subjective, people lose their ability to recognize deception, not only in the world around them, but also within their own thinking. What makes the present moment feel different to many observers is not just that challenges exist, but that they appear to be converging. Cultural instability, moral confusion, weakening belief systems, and increasing polarization all seem to be occurring at the same time. For some, this is interpreted as coincidence or natural evolution of society. For others who view history through a spiritual lens, it appears as part of a larger pattern that has been described in various ways across centuries. Traditional theological thought, there is an understanding that humanity can move through periods of relative stability and periods of severe testing. These periods of testing are often associated with a weakening of spiritual awareness and a rise in moral disorder. In such times, people become more focused on material concerns, personal identity, and immediate gratification, while deeper questions about truth, purpose, and accountability are gradually pushed aside. Over time, this shift can reshape entire cultures without most people noticing it happening in real time. At the same time, there has been a noticeable decline in practices that were once central to spiritual life for many believers. Regular participation in sacraments, communal worship, and personal disciplines of faith have diminished in many places. For those who view these practices not as symbolic rituals but as essential sources of spiritual strength, their absence represents more than cultural change. It represents a weakening of the internal framework that traditionally helped individuals resist moral confusion and spiritual vulnerability. This is also where interpretations begin to diverge. Some see these changes as simply the result of modernization, education, and scientific advancement. Others argue that while those factors are real, do not fully explain the depth of spiritual disorientation that many people report experiencing. From that perspective, issue is not only external change but internal loss of orientation, a gradual disconnect from what was once understood as objective moral truth. There is also a growing sense among certain theological thinkers that the current era reflects something that has been described symbolically in ancient texts and prophetic writings. These references often speak in metaphorical language about periods of deception, confusion, and intensified struggle. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, consistently point to the idea that there are moments in history when the pressure on human conscience and belief becomes significantly stronger. It is within this framework that some observers interpret the present moment. Not as the end of history in a literal sense, and not as a sudden collapse, but as a phase of intensification where existing spiritual and moral tensions become more visible and more difficult to ignore. In such a phase, people are often forced to re-examine what they believe, why they believe it, and what authority they trust when everything around them feels unstable. This is not presented as a call to fear, nor as an attempt to predict exact outcomes. Instead, it is a call to awareness, because in any period of confusion, clarity becomes the most valuable resource, and in any period of instability, ability to discern truth from distortion becomes essential for navigating what comes next. What follows from here is a deeper examination of how these patterns are understood within theological tradition, how they are interpreted through historical teachings, and why many believe that the current moment carries a significance that should not be ignored. And from this point forward, the discussion moves deeper into the spiritual dynamics that many believe are shaping the world today. To understand why the present moment feels so unstable to many people, it is necessary to go deeper into how spiritual tradition interprets the relationship between human behavior and unseen realities. Within classical theological thought, history is not viewed as random or purely material. Instead, it is often understood as a field where moral choices, collective behavior, and spiritual realities interact in ways that are not always immediately visible but become clearer over time. From this perspective, one of the most important ideas is that human freedom has consequences that extend beyond the individual. When societies collectively move toward or away from moral order, that movement is believed to shape not only culture but also the spiritual conditions under which people live. In traditional language, this is often described as a relationship between grace and disorder, where increasing rejection of moral truth leads to a weakening of spiritual protection at a collective level. This idea is not presented as mechanical cause and effect, but as a moral and spiritual principle. It suggests that when truth is consistently rejected, confusion naturally increases, not only in behavior, but also in perception. People begin to lose clarity about what is real, what is good, and what is harmful. Over time, this confusion can become normalized, especially when reinforced by cultural systems, education, media, and institutional messaging. In many classical teachings, process is described as gradual rather than sudden. Societies do not collapse in a single moment. Instead, they drift. Small compromises accumulate. What was once unthinkable becomes debated. What was once debated becomes accepted. What was once accepted becomes celebrated. This slow transformation is often difficult to recognize while it is happening because each step feels minor on its own. Within this framework, spiritual tradition introduces another important concept, the weakening of moral perception when truth is treated as subjective. When people are taught that truth depends entirely on perspective, emotion, personal preference, the ability to recognize deception becomes less stable. Not because intelligence disappears, but because the reference point for evaluating truth becomes fragmented. This fragmentation has practical consequences. If there is no shared understanding of truth, then there is no stable basis for agreement about morality, justice, or even reality itself. Conflicts increase not only between groups but within individuals who may hold contradictory beliefs without recognizing the internal tension. This is one reason why many modern thinkers describe the current age as psychologically and morally disoriented. From a theological standpoint, this condition is significant because it affects discernment. Discernment, in traditional language, is the ability to distinguish between what leads toward truth and what leads away from it. When discernment weakens, people become more vulnerable to manipulation, not necessarily because they are weaker, but because the criteria for judgment have been destabilized. This is where spiritual tradition introduces the idea of deception operating at multiple levels. Not merely deception in the sense of obvious lies, but deeper forms of confusion where truth and falsehood are mixed in ways that are difficult to separate. In such conditions, even well-intentioned individuals can find themselves misled, not through ignorance alone, but through the complexity of the environment they are trying to interpret. Historically, this type of confusion has been associated in religious language with periods of trial or testing where the clarity of belief is challenged by external and internal pressures at the same time. External pressures include cultural change, institutional instability, and social conflict. Internal pressures include doubt, fear, fatigue, and the gradual erosion of confidence in previously held convictions. In this sense, present moment is interpreted by some theological voices as a convergence of pressures rather than a single crisis. Multiple systems, cultural, moral, technological, and spiritual, appear to be shifting simultaneously. Each system influences the others, creating a feedback loop where uncertainty increases as complexity increases. At the cultural level, rapid changes in norms and values have made it difficult for many people to maintain a stable sense of identity or moral direction. At the institutional level, trust in traditional sources of authority has declined significantly. At the personal level, increasing isolation and digital dependence have reduced the depth of face-to-face community life, historically played a key role in forming moral character and resilience. When these factors are combined, the result is not simply confusion, but fragmentation. People may still function in daily life, but their sense of meaning becomes thinner, more fragile, and more dependent on external validation. In such an environment, emotional intensity often replaces stable conviction, and reaction replaces reflection. Within spiritual interpretation, this is where vulnerability increases. Not necessarily vulnerability in a physical sense, but vulnerability in terms of perception and judgment. When individuals and societies lose stable reference points, they become more susceptible to narratives that offer clarity, even if that clarity is artificial or incomplete. The desire for certainty becomes stronger precisely when certainty becomes harder to find. It's in this context that many theological traditions warn about periods in which confusion itself becomes a tool of influence, not because confusion is engineered in a simple or direct way, but because conditions of instability naturally allow stronger narratives to dominate weaker ones. When people are exhausted by uncertainty, they tend to gravitate toward whatever appears coherent, even if they have not fully examined its foundation. This does not require assuming conspiracy or intentional design. From a purely historical and psychological standpoint, societies under stress tend to simplify their thinking. Complex moral frameworks are replaced with binary choices. Nuance is replaced with certainty. And over time, ability to engage with complexity diminishes. The concern raised by many within the theological tradition is not simply that confusion exists, but that it becomes self-reinforcing. Once a culture loses shared grounding in truth, it becomes increasingly difficult to restore it without some form of deep correction or reorientation. This is why periods of moral and spiritual instability are often described in dramatic language within religious texts, not necessarily to predict specific events, but to emphasize the seriousness of losing clarity. At this stage of the discussion, the focus shifts from diagnosing the condition of the world to understanding the implications of that condition for individuals. Because regardless of how one interprets these patterns, Every person must eventually decide how they will respond to uncertainty and what principles will guide them when external clarity is no longer guaranteed. And from here, the narrative moves closer to the question of response, responsibility, and the inner discipline required to remain grounded in truth during unstable times. As this sense of instability deepens, the most important question is no longer simply what is happening in the world, but how an individual is meant to respond to it. Because regardless of how one interprets cultural change, historical cycles, or spiritual warnings, every person eventually reaches a point where external certainty becomes less reliable and internal grounding becomes essential. Classical theological thought, this is where the focus shifts from observation to formation. Is not enough to analyze the world correctly if the soul itself is not properly ordered. The condition of the inner life determines how a person interprets external events. Two people can witness the same situation and arrive at completely different conclusions, not because the facts differ, but because their internal frameworks differ. This is why spiritual tradition places such emphasis on practices that form the mind and the will. Practices are not presented as abstract rituals, but as disciplines that stabilize perception over time. Without this internal stability, individuals are more easily shaped by external pressures, shifting narratives, and emotional reactions that change from moment to moment. One of the key ideas in this tradition is that clarity is not automatic. It must be cultivated. In the same way that physical strength requires repetition and discipline, spiritual and moral clarity require consistent formation. Without that formation, even sincere individuals can become confused, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack grounding. Within this framework, sacramental life is understood not as symbolic expression, but as a stabilizing structure for the soul. Participation in these practices is viewed as a way of aligning the individual with a deeper moral and spiritual order that does not change with cultural trends. When that alignment weakens or disappears, the individual becomes more exposed to confusion, not necessarily through external attack, but through internal disorientation. This is also where the role of conscience becomes central. Conscience, in classical thought, is not simply personal preference or emotional reaction. It is understood as the capacity to recognize moral truth and respond to it. Conscience itself can become dull or distorted if it is not formed and maintained. Repeated compromise, rationalization, or neglect of truth can gradually weaken its sensitivity. Over time, this weakening does not feel dramatic. It feels normal. Small adjustments in behavior and belief accumulate until what once felt clearly wrong begins to feel acceptable or at least tolerable. Process is subtle, which is why it is often difficult to recognize in real time. People rarely feel themselves becoming less clear. They usually believe they are simply adapting. At a broader level, this same process can occur within entire communities. Shared moral assumptions begin to shift. What was once universally understood becomes debated. What was once supported by tradition becomes questioned. Eventually, the shared language of moral clarity begins to fragment. People no longer assume that others share their basic understanding of right and wrong. In such conditions, communication itself becomes more difficult. Words begin to lose stable meaning because they are interpreted through different frameworks. Simple concepts can become sources of conflict, not because the concepts themselves are complex, but because there is no longer agreement on how they should be defined. This fragmentation of meaning is one of the central concerns in theological interpretations of cultural decline. When language loses stability, thought loses stability. And when thought loses stability, action becomes inconsistent and reactive. This creates a cycle in which confusion feeds more confusion, not necessarily through external force, but through internal disintegration. At the same time, spiritual tradition emphasizes that this condition is not irreversible at the individual level. While cultures may shift broadly, individuals retain the capacity to choose clarity, discipline, and truth. However, this choice is not passive. requires deliberate resistance to distraction, fragmentation, and the constant pull towards superficial engagement with life. In practical terms, this means cultivating habits that reinforce stability, consistent reflection, structured moral practice, participation in a community of shared belief all contribute to strengthening the inner life. Without these supports, individuals are more likely to be shaped by whatever influence is most immediate or emotionally compelling. Another important aspect of this teaching is the recognition that human beings are not purely rational in practice. While reason is essential, it is often influenced by desire, fear, fatigue, and social pressure. This means that clarity is not just an intellectual achievement, but a moral one. It depends on the alignment between what a person believes and how they live. When that alignment breaks down, cognitive dissonance increases. People may know one thing but act in contradiction to it. Over time, tension can either lead to correction or to rationalization. In rationalization, beliefs are adjusted to match behavior rather than behavior being adjusted to match beliefs. This reversal is one of the subtle mechanisms by which confusion deepens. From a spiritual perspective, this is not merely a psychological issue, but a moral one, because it involves the gradual weakening of the will's commitment to truth. And once the will becomes detached from truth, the intellect becomes more easily influenced by whatever explanation reduces discomfort or preserves convenience. This is why many theological traditions warn that the greatest danger is not always external opposition, but internal compromise. External opposition can sometimes strengthen conviction. Internal compromise, however, weakens it from within, making resistance more difficult over time. At this stage, the importance of intentional formation becomes even clearer. Without intentional practices that reinforce truth, the natural drift toward confusion continues. With them, however, it becomes possible to maintain stability even in unstable environments. And so the focus begins to shift again from understanding the nature of decline and confusion toward understanding the practical means by which an individual can remain anchored in truth even when the surrounding environment becomes increasingly uncertain. As the discussion continues, it becomes necessary to move from diagnosis toward consequence, because understanding confusion is not enough if a person does not also understand what happens when confusion is left unaddressed over time. In theological reflection, there is a consistent emphasis on the fact that moral and spiritual instability does not remain static. It develops, it intensifies, and it eventually produces outcomes that affect both individuals and societies in very tangible ways. One of the key ideas in this tradition is that human beings are not only influenced by external forces, but also shaped by the long-term consequences of their own choices. When truth is consistently accepted and lived, clarity increases. When truth is repeatedly ignored or resisted, clarity diminishes. This is not framed as punishment in a simplistic sense, but as a natural unfolding of moral reality over time. In this way, confusion is not always introduced from outside. It can also emerge gradually from within, as a result of repeated decisions that weaken a person's ability to perceive reality clearly. Compromise may seem small, but together they form a pattern, and patterns, once established, become increasingly difficult to reverse without conscious effort and deep transformation. At the societal level, the process can be even more complex. Institutions, cultures, and generations do not shift overnight. They evolve through cumulative decisions made across many years. When those decisions consistently move away from stable moral foundations, the resulting environment becomes less predictable, more fragmented, and more difficult to navigate for everyone involved. Within this framework, spiritual tradition often describes a stage where confusion begins to feel normal, not because it is inherently desirable, but because it becomes so widespread that it no longer feels unusual. People adapt to instability in the same way they adapt to noise in a crowded environment. Eventually, they stop noticing it, even though it continues to affect them. At this point, a deeper problem emerges. When confusion becomes normalized, the threshold for recognizing it rises. In other words, people require more extreme examples of disorder before they acknowledge that disorder exists. Subtle distortions of truth are no longer recognized as distortions because the baseline has shifted. This makes correction more difficult because awareness itself has been dulled. In theological language, this is sometimes described as a loss of sensitivity in conscience, not a complete absence of moral awareness, but a gradual dulling of its responsiveness. What once provoked concern or reflection may now be dismissed as irrelevant or exaggerated. Over time, this shift changes how individuals interpret both their own actions and the actions of others. Another important aspect of this process is the way language itself changes. Words that once carried clear moral meaning begin to expand, contract, or shift depending on context. This creates ambiguity not only in communication, but also in thought. When language loses precision, ideas lose stability. And when ideas lose stability, shared understanding becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. This is particularly significant in spiritual interpretation because many traditions rely on preciseless language to transmit moral and theological truths across generations. When that precision erodes, even well-intentioned discussions can become confused as terms are reinterpreted in ways that diverge from their original meaning. Over time, this can lead to fragmentation within communities that once shared a common framework. At the individual level, consequences of prolonged confusion often appear as internal conflict. People may feel divided within themselves, unsure of what they believe or why they believe it. They may experience inconsistency between values and actions, or between private convictions and public behavior. This internal division is not always visible to others, but it can significantly affect a person's sense of stability and direction. In response to this condition, spiritual tradition emphasizes the importance of recentering the self around stable principles. Principles are not meant to be abstract ideals alone, but lived commitments that shape daily behavior. Without such grounding, individuals are more likely to be influenced by whatever external pressure is most immediate or emotionally compelling. At the same time, there is recognition that human beings are not static. They are capable of change, correction, and renewal. Even when confusion has developed over time, it is still possible to recover clarity through deliberate effort. However, the process typically requires humility, patience, and a willingness to reassess assumptions that may have gone unexamined for years. This is where the role of discipline becomes central. Discipline, in this context, is not merely self-control in a narrow sense, but a structured commitment to truth over convenience. It involves choosing consistency over fluctuation, reflection over reaction, depth over immediacy. Without discipline, clarity tends to dissolve under pressure. With it, clarity can be maintained even in difficult circumstances. Another important theme is the role of environment. Human beings are deeply shaped by the communities and influences surrounding them. When a person is consistently exposed to fragmented or contradictory messages, it becomes more difficult to maintain internal coherence. Conversely, when a person is embedded in a community that reinforces truth and stability, their capacity for clarity is strengthened. This is why spiritual tradition consistently emphasizes the importance of communal life, not as a social preference, but as a structural necessity for maintaining moral and spiritual formation. Isolation, especially in times of widespread confusion, increases vulnerability, not necessarily because individuals are weak, but because they lack reinforcement of stable reference points. At this stage of reflection, it becomes clear that confusion is not only an external condition, but also an internal challenge. It affects perception, language, memory, decision-making, and emotional stability. And because of this, addressing it requires more than awareness. Requires active reconstruction of how a person thinks, chooses, and relates to truth. As the narrative continues, focus naturally begins to shift toward the idea of response, because understanding the nature of instability is only the first step. The more important question now becomes how an individual is meant to remain grounded, coherent, and faithful to truth when the surrounding environment no longer reliably supports it.